All right, so today's art workshop is going to be on approaching 3D modeling. We're going to go over the first steps that you need to do to begin modeling a real-life object. If you haven't already, if you could go and scan that QR code so that we can keep track of people who have come to this workshop. It helps us know what you guys are interested in and what you're showing up to. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to move on to the workshop. So, first off, we're going to talk about the mentorship program. So it's still accepting applicants for both mentors and mentees. It's a really great opportunity to meet new EGaDS members. So consider mentoring if you're an older member, and if you're a new member, this might be an opportunity for you to learn a lot more about the org and video game design. The form to apply is under announcements in our Discord server, and the form says it will only accept applications until February 8th, but it is still open. So go click on that form, sign up. It's really cool. Okay. So what are workshops? Our art workshops provide intro-friendly courses to creating art for video games, software tutorials for beginners in both 2D and 3D. Our fall workshops were focused on 2D, and now that we're getting into the spring, most of them are going to be 3D focused, so expect a lot more of that. It's a space for one-on-one help with artistic growth, so you can show up in person if you want some more focused feedback. And it's a community of really cool artists who are going to support you on your journey. So you can go follow the Art Workshops Discord channel if you haven't already. It's on our main EGaDS server. It's really, really cool, and you can get updates on whenever we're doing one of these. Make sure you don't miss them. Okay, let's get to the actual content of this workshop. So right now we're going to talk about 3D modeling in Blender. If you don't know what Blender is, it's a really cool program for 3D modeling because it's completely free and open source. And every year it gets more features, so it seems like a really great entry point for just about anyone. It's quite approachable. So that is where we're going to start learning. So let's talk about the process of 3D modeling. There are a lot of steps, but if you break it down, it's really not that bad. So step one is concept art and gathering references. You need to know what you're making before you start actually making it. You want to know what the different angles of it are. You want to know what the final object is supposed to look like. Step two is blocking, which is making a rough outline of that object so that you get a gist of what your final model is going to look like. Make sure you define the silhouette, and then that is going to help you be guided down the next steps, like step three, modeling and sculpting. That's where you're taking that silhouette and refining all the little details and making sure that you know what your model is supposed to look like with its full detail. Retopology is taking a very high poly model, so a model that has a lot of little pieces and faces, and then mapping all of that information to the textures of a lower poly model of the same thing. If you don't know what poly means, don't worry. We're going to talk about that in a second. It's really not that bad. But in the gist of it is that retopology lets you make a really less detailed, less difficult for a game to run model look just as good as a really expensive, hard for a game to run model. Then the next steps we're actually not going to really talk much about today. Today's focus is on those first 4 steps of 3D modeling, but I will let you know the next steps are UV unwrapping, baking, texturing and materials, and lighting and rendering. So we're talking about making the model today, and then next workshop we're going to talk about how you can make that model look good. Okay, step 1, concept art and gathering references. So, gathering references. Oh, we're having a vacuum come in. 1 second. We're doing a workshop. Could you come to this room later? Thank you so much. Sorry. Exciting. Okay, so gathering references. Really important first step of 3D modeling. Even if you want to make custom concept art for your specific 3D model, it's extremely important to have real life references from multiple different angles. Because you might think in your head that you know exactly what something looks like, but you'll find when you're halfway through modeling it that you actually don't know what the shape of that thing is. So it's super important that you have references from multiple angles, like the top or the bottom or the side of the object, because when you're 3D modeling, you have to consider how something looks from every single angle. So, more about gathering references. There's a super cool app that you can get, it's free, called Pure Ref, and it lets you organize your gathered reference images and keep them on your screen while working. So I think that's super helpful. You can gather references, put them into PureRef, and then have that up on the side of your screen while you're drawing your concept art, if you do concept art. Also, Pinterest, great selection and variety of images, and it lets you organize the gathered images into boards. So you can make a board about 3D models and have a bunch of 3D models that other people have made in there as reference. Or you could have a board about the specific model or goal that you're shooting for, and then you can reference that as you're working on the project and see if you're hitting that. Also, when you're gathering references, please be careful not to take an artist's work and model it if you plan to post it online. Credit and permission is important. So don't pull up someone's really cool 2D character and decide to 3D model it and then post it without ever talking to that person. Very important that you don't just rip off their art. You can find 3D models for reference on Sketchfab and ArtStation to reference examples of other artists' work for inspiration. Sketchfab is actually really cool because it has a bunch of 3D models that you can turn around in 3D just on the website. So you can see all the different angles of something and how other artists might have modeled something. And also it's a really cool site. Lots of different types of things. ArtStation is very high quality, very professional work from all sorts of different pro artists. That's this down here. It is really, really cool, but the stuff is very high level. Concept art. So you've got your references, they're super awesome. If you feel confident drawing, concept art is extremely helpful. It allows you to make something very specific for your model. A few drawbacks are that you need a really good grasp of forms and you have to draw many angles. You can't just draw one angle and expect that that's going to be enough for modeling. You're going to need to know what the side view, what the top view, bottom view of your object looks like, and that's going to help you make that model in the end. So let me show you how you could use those angles. So if you're making a character, the model should be unposed. You need a T or an A pose. You always see T poses when you look at video game characters. It's become a bit of a running joke, but the reason that they do that kind of pose is because that pose doesn't have any deformation or strange movement of parts of the character, so you can see how everything looks like. You also want to draw orthographic turnarounds, so a front, side, back, and top. And you want to make sure that you're being really consistent. The sizes of pieces of the character should not change on each side. But once you have these, this is like your final guideline. This is what you're going to use to make your model. It's going to be super helpful. So moving on to importing into Blender. Once you have all of those different angles, you can press Shift A and then Image and then Reference, or just drag your image directly into the Blender viewport. It's going to bring up a positionable image as a plane that you can put at whatever angle you need in Blender. And it's going to let you make something as close as possible to your finished product before you start. So this is an example of someone who's pulled in reference images for a green car. So you can see that there's a front car angle positioned this way, there's a side car angle this way, and then there's a bottom car angle looking up. So if you were to move the camera around in that Blender scene, you could look at that car almost as if it was a 3D object. And that's like so helpful when you're modeling. So this is an example of someone who's making a character, and this character, they are using their reference image to see the positioning at a side angle and at a front angle. So that might give you an idea of how helpful this can be. All right, so now that we're done talking about references and concept art, does anyone have any questions? Anyone in person or online? I would love to answer them. If you don't, it's okay. Just, I would love to help if anyone has any questions. Okay, if you think of anything, let me know, but for now, I'm going to move on to blocking. So you've got your references in, you know exactly what your object is going to look like from different angles. Now you need to start blocking. Blocking is constructing a basic object shape using just primitives. Primitives in 3D modeling are all of the shapes that are already built into the software in Blender. So cubes, cylinders, spheres, everything like that. Really easy to just throw that stuff in really quickly. You press Shift A and then you have a bunch of options. You can just add any of them. If you use these to build out your object, it lets you establish correct proportions and silhouette early. Sometimes it's called gray boxing. So doing this lets you see what your final object is going to look like silhouette-wise before you get into all the detail of it. It's really important that you do this because otherwise you might start working really hard on a little detail, and then when you zoom out and look at it, you'll realize that the whole shape of the object is off, and you aren't really going to be able to change it at that point because it's already modeled. So you'd have to start from scratch. So blocking, super important. Yeah, why does blocking matter? So if you block, you avoid wasting hours on high detail only to discover silhouette issues later, and you create a quick base for use later when you're refining and polishing. You want to think about failing faster. When you're 3D modeling, especially when you're learning for the first time, you're going to mess it up. You're going to have something completely break. You're going to have UVs flip the wrong way. So you want to be able to move as fast as possible to that failure so that you can start over and succeed the next time. Okay, tips for blocking. You want to focus on overall forms and proportions. So think about the overall silhouette, how that object is going to read, and you want to use those references that you have. So those references that you've pulled in, you want to make sure that you're actually looking back at them and using them to define what that silhouette's going to be. Constantly check your silhouette as you're going. Is it clear and readable? You're making this for a video game, so you want players to be able to easily and quickly recognize what an object is and what its purpose is in a scene. You also want to keep checking all those different angles. You made those different concept art angles for a reason, so make sure that you're using them. Look at side angles, look at top angles. Keep checking to make sure that everything is fitting the object that you're wanting to create in the end. Okay, so let's play a little game. Is this a good or bad blockout? What do you guys think? Is this a good blockout? What do you think?
Is it supposed to be open?
So this is just them showing a 3D object here, but this is a good blockout. So this is someone, they're making some kind of ape character, and they laid out each of the pieces of it using basic shapes. Any deformation on it is pretty simple. This is a good way that you would block out a character like this. Okay, is this good or bad for an environment blockout if you're trying to see what a house might look like? I would say this one also pretty good. This one's a little bit more detailed, so they've pushed a little further than just most basic shapes. They've modeled things a little bit, but considering that this is going to be like a really high detail professional final piece, and all of these might become very detailed later, this is a good blockout. Okay, what about this one though? How's this one as a blockout? Not good, right? Why is it not good?
Too detailed.
Yeah, too detailed. And you can see that they're just using one object that they've kind of pushed around the vertices on. So you can't actually see what that final shape or silhouette's going to be. Also doesn't look like they're using any sort of reference here. So this one here might have some issues. You want to make sure that you're doing a block out with simple shapes first. Okay, helpful shortcuts when you're blocking. This is going to hit you really fast. This is a lot of different shortcuts I'm going to give you, but I promise they're super helpful. So in Blender, Tab lets you toggle Edit and Object mode. Edit mode lets you edit one particular object, its shape or deforming it. Object mode lets you position multiple in one scene. So you're moving constantly between these two modes as you're working in Blender. You'll be in object mode when you're laying out multiple different objects at once and moving them around, and then you'll press Tab and switch to edit mode on the one that you've clicked on and deform that one how you need. So that'll be super helpful in your workflow, speed you way up. While you're in edit mode, you can press 1, 2, and 3 to edit the vertices, edges, and faces respectively. So let's say that I've got a box and I want it to be taller. I could quickly press Tab to enter edit mode, and then I could press 3 to enter face mode, and I could select that face on the top, right? And then you can actually press G to grab the face, and then you could pull it upwards. So I actually didn't put G on here. G is really helpful. That's grab and move something. You can press A to select all. So if you were in this example in edit mode on faces, you could press A and select all the faces at the same time. E is extrude, so whatever you're holding onto, extrude means to extend it outwards. So that box, if we're holding the top face and you press E, you could pull that face out into any direction you want and extend the box. S is scale, so make something larger. If you scaled just the bottom face of a box, it might end up looking like a pyramid. And then finally, this one's a little complicated, locking to a specific axis. But once you understand what this does, it is so helpful. So, for example, I've got a box. I have the whole thing selected in object mode. I press S to scale. Now, I could press S and scale, and it would scale the whole box equally. But if I press S and then I press Z, it will only scale the box along the Z axis. So the box will only become taller up and down. So if you can imagine that, you can see how that might be like really, really helpful in this kind of situation. You can press S and X and only scale along the X axis and keep everything constrained to those axes. This works for G as well. So if I went into edit mode, selected 2 or 3 vertices, and then pressed G, I could move just those vertices. VZ, I'll move just those vertices on the Z axis. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm sure your head is spinning, and I'm so sorry, but I'm giving you just a few more. So those are the shortcuts for modeling tips. These are the shortcuts for viewing. So when you're looking at a scene, you can press certain buttons on the number pad to switch to different sides of the view. So when you're pressing 1, you're looking at the front, 3, the right, 9, switch the opposite side, 7, the top. Okay, so that's a lot, but you don't need to have them all memorized right now as long as you know that this is a thing and it exists and you can Google it later. You can press number pad 5 to toggle between perspective and orthographic views. I have a little asterisk because I'm going to come back to that one. And you can also press 0 to activate your active camera view and look through whatever camera you have in your scene. Final hotkey I'm giving you right now, you can press period to frame the selected object. So whatever object you've clicked on in your scene, you press period and it's going to pull in your camera to look at that one. So I told you with that asterisk, I'm going to go back to perspective and orthographic. Perspective view is the idea of what you see in real life. If I'm looking at a table in perspective view from the side, the part that's further away from me is going to look smaller because that's how human eyes and cameras work. Orthographic view breaks that. It lets you see everything at the exact same size. This is actually really helpful. You want to go into orthographic view, especially for sculpting a lot. And it might look weird at first, but what it lets you see is if things are actually equal in size. An example of a project where I used orthographic view a ton is that I sculpted a lot of figurines for some of my friends. And while I was sculpting them, I had to make sure that certain pieces like the hands or the feet were the same size and that the characters all looked proportionally correct because I was going to 3D print them. So I sculpted a ton of them in orthographic view because that let me actually see all the different pieces of the character. Okay, wow, that was a lot of hotkeys. However, they're key to an efficient workflow in Blender, pun intended. So knowing all of these hotkeys is actually going to help you a ton. They're going to help you go so much faster. You're going to be able to iterate. You're going to be able to fail faster. You're going to get a lot more done quicker. So don't put off learning them. You might think that, oh, when I'm a professional, I'm going to learn these. But if you learn them now as a beginner, you're going to become a professional a lot faster. So I'll give you just the most important ones to know. So forget all those ones I talked about, you can learn them over time. But right now you should know that if you press A, it selects everything. If you press E, it extrudes. So this image on the far left, that's an extrusion. It's actually from the Blender manual on their website, which I totally recommend. But if you selected those 4 faces, you press E, they're all going to stick out as you pull your mouse. And then S for scale, to make something larger. I'm going to add one more in here that I forgot while making these slides. G for grab is super helpful. It lets you move a piece of an object around. So A, E, S, and G. Really, really important. And I know I'm going kind of fast. I have a lot of content I want to get through, but if you guys have any questions, please let me know. I'm really happy to help and to answer questions. We're moving on to step 3, modeling and sculpting. Does anyone have any questions about everything that I just talked about there? Because that was a lot. Okay, my person in person does not have questions. Do any of you online have any questions? All right, I'm going to move on. So, moving on to step 3. Hard surface versus sculpting. So let's say that you've done everything that we just talked about. You got your reference images, you made your concept art from all the different orthographic angles, you pulled it into Blender, and you made a block out of your object. So now you need to decide how you're going to keep modeling this thing. Are you going to think about hard surface or sculpting? These are both really awesome techniques, and sometimes you can kind of mix them in a project, but it's good to know the difference between them. Hard surface is inorganic shapes. You manipulate vertices, edges, faces, almost in a mathematical way. Pros to that is that there's a lower poly count, so easier to have it be more performant. It's easier to edit, and you've got clean geometry. The cons are that it's a lot harder to represent curves and soft shapes, and it's a lot less natural of a sculpting experience. So if you're coming from an art background, you might have a bit of trouble with this at first because you're not going to be experiencing like a sculptor would sculpt with a ball of clay. You're going to be really thinking mathematically about how you're going to lay out all of these different points to connect things. But it can be really, really helpful. It's important. Sculpting is like you're manipulating digital clay. It's good for organic shapes. So you can make fast organic forms. It has intuitive and natural sculpting. But some cons are that it has a really high poly count because you have so many polygons in there in order to be able to sculpt and manipulate that clay. So doing retopology, which we're going to talk about in a minute, is absolutely necessary. Also, creating fully clean edges and hard lines is a lot more difficult with sculpting. So you really want to think about if your project actually requires sculpting. Okay, so here are some examples of hard surface modeling versus sculpting. So I tried to pull some images where you can really see the advantages and disadvantages of each one of these. Depending on what kind of project you were approaching, going with one of these methods over the other might make it go way, way faster. So if you were modeling something like a car or a suit of armor or a drill like up here, you would definitely want to think about hard surface. You don't want to be taking a ball of clay and trying to sculpt it into the exact kind of shapes that armor or a robot or a drill would have. However, as you can imagine, when I was talking about the extruding and the scaling, something like a really realistic human face or a character would be really hard to do with hard surface. Obviously possible, and plenty of people have done it, but if you're getting started, probably you want to think about which one of these to choose. Okay, continued talking about modeling versus sculpting. So your silhouette is set. You've decided if you're going to start working in a hard modeling kind of workflow or in a sculpting kind of workflow. You're going to continue to reference. You might think at this point, no, I got it. I got my objects laid out. I know what this is going to look like. I made concept art. But no, you don't know what things look like. You need to look at references because references are going to actually show you what physical objects in the real world look like. Especially if you're making something realistic, it is super duper important. But even if you're making something stylized, things like clothing wrinkles or the ways that a box might have dust on the side or damage, that's something you want to look at an actual version of because that's going to help you a ton. Now you want to add detailing that needs to be shown in actual 3D and can't be faked later with texture painting and materials. What I mean by this is that if you want to have, for example, let's say that you're making some sort of shield and it's going to have little bullet dings in it. You don't actually probably need to 3D model those. You could just model a shield normally, and then later when you're on your painting stage, you can paint those little holes and you don't have to worry about all of the different breaking up of little pieces of that model. And in 3D modeling, it's not just color that you change with these textures that you add. You can actually change the way that light bounces off things or the height of things. So you might be able to do some really detailed kinds of texture work without having to 3D model it. I'm thinking about in games that I've seen before, there might have a line of ruins, and on the edge of the ruins, they have these intricate murals carved that look 3D. Those are definitely not 3D modeled. Those are definitely, they did it later with normal maps and texture painting. Now you're going to refine shapes, you're going to add volume, and also you're going to probably, if you're making a game character especially, keep pieces as separate objects. If you want to animate this later, you don't want to combine everything together right now. You want your head and your neck and your torso to be separate, or if you're making some sort of gun, you probably want the different pieces of the gun to be separate so that they can be moved around and manipulated later in your game. Special sculpting software. So let's say you're like, hey, I don't want to do hard surface modeling. I don't like that. I just want to sculpt. I want to be the best sculptor ever. Awesome. You'll probably need to do hard surface modeling at some point, but if you want to get started sculpting, let's talk about the options. The industry standard special sculpting software is ZBrush. However, it is super expensive. It does not have a student trial. It is hundreds of dollars. So if you want to have something that's going to look amazing on your resume and you have some cash to spare, ZBrush is a really great tool. However, there are more affordable options. My favorite one, I was talking about, I made those little characters for my friends. I did those in Nomad Sculpt. Nomad Sculpt is really cool. It has a PC version and a tablet version. I think it's like $25 for a lifetime license. It's not subscription. You just have it forever. So super, super cool. Totally recommend more people should know about it. Can do a ton of stuff. Both can be used in conjunction with Blender, so you can export models directly from there. You could take a model that you made in Blender, bring it into ZBrush or Nomad, refine all the little details on it, and bring it back into Blender. You can sculpt in Blender itself too. It's really cool, even though it's open source, it's got a ton of features, but it's really not as intuitive as sculpting in specific platforms like the two that I just mentioned, and it has some limitations. So you want to think about if you think it's worth buying these or learning to work in these in addition to Blender for the additional features they'll give you, or if you think that you can do it just in Blender proper. Okay, this is a really, really big topic. It is a way bigger topic than the one slide I'm giving it, but it's not something that I think that we should talk about for a ton of slides today, so I'll try to condense all of the knowledge of this into one slide. So, topology. In the process of modeling, you always want to consider topology. Topology is the layout of polygons along the faces of the object that you're making. So it's the way that you can see in this image here, all of those little geometric pieces that you've created are going to combine together to make your final image. It is especially important for game props and of everything the most important for animated objects because this determines how they're going to deform when you animate them. Good topology is debated among 3D modelers. People might have different opinions about what is okay or what works well, but in general, good topology means that the shading works correctly, you've used the least amount of faces possible to achieve your goal, and you use as many quads as possible. Okay, so I have a slide where we're going to talk about some topology pitfalls. Common topology errors. So I told you need as many quads as possible. One of these errors is making a lot of n-gons. N-gons are polygons with more than 4 sides. They lead to shading errors, especially on curved surfaces. So if you have a character, you don't want a giant n-gon on their nose with 5 sides because that's going to lead to a bunch of weird shading later. Triangles. So quads, like I just talked about, 4-sided polygons should be used wherever possible because they're easier to edit, they shade predictably, and they can subdivide easily. Subdivide is a feature that you can add on top of your model. It's called a modifier, where it automatically creates new lines through all of your different polygons to divide them further, and then you have more polygons immediately on your model. If you have a model with lots of quads and you subdivide on it, it's going to look really clean and suddenly look way smoother and nicer. But if you don't have a lot of quads, then it's not going to the polygons are not going to subdivide easily, and then it's not going to look good when you use that. So you want to think about quads. Duplicates and slivers are really bad. So that's extremely small polygons. It's taking up your polygon count, but not actually contributing to the model. Or vertices, edges, and faces that have accidentally been duplicated or stacked on top of each other. Blender has some features that can deal with duplicates where it can combine or collapse onto each other pieces that are right on top of each other. So check those out. Those are cool. And then in general, just when you're making your model, try to avoid those. Okay. Any questions before we move on to retopology, which is really interesting and cool?
Why is it that you want them in 4 instead of like in 3 or in 5?
So the way that, okay, so I don't know if you guys can hear the question was asked, but the question was, why is it that you want it in 4 instead of 3 or 5 on the edges? And the answer is pretty complicated because it has to do with how computers render 3D objects, which is pretty detailed. But in general, the way that it works is that a computer is always going to split stuff up into tries. So if you've got a 4-sided object, when it renders it to a game, it's always going to cut it in half to 2 triangles, right? But if you have it all quads, when the computer goes and cuts it all into triangles and then decides how the shading works on everything, it's going to be able to do that pretty easily because quads are easy for it to cut into triangles. But if you have an object with like a bunch of 5-sided or 4-sided and it all is kind of weird, when it cuts it all up for shading, it's going to look odd because it's not going to divide up easily for the computer. But just in general, it's something about how the computer is able to process lighting on the object. And it's a really detailed topic, and there's a bunch more stuff here that I haven't gone into. But if you want to search up topology videos, there's a ton of them. They can help you a bunch. But like the most important thing is as many quads as possible. Quads, quads, quads. Okay. Let's talk about retopology. So we just talked about topology. What could retopology be? I have a question. Which of these two models do you think would run easier in a game engine? Which one do you think would run easier?
The one with the one on the right.
The one on the right. Okay. So let's talk about why that might be true. But first, what about these two? Which of these two do you think would run better? They look pretty identical, right? So I just told you that computers render using tries from polygons. So depending on how many polygons an object has in a game, it might slow down your computer. If you have a really laggy game that you've been playing, it might be because they didn't budget their polygons well for all their different objects, and the computer's trying to render way too much at once. That's why when you walk into a really detailed area in a game, or an area with really dynamic lighting, especially on older games, it's going to lag because your computer is trying to render all of those different polygons. So one of these has a few more polygons than the other, but you can't really tell. So let me show you. Where did it go? Excuse you. Okay. This high poly model has 1 million vertices. Has 1,300,000 vertices. This low poly model has 14,500 vertices. That's a pretty big difference, but they look identical. And the reason they're able to look identical, even though this one should look way less quality, is because of retopology. So how does that work? Here's another example. On the left, this axe here has 800,000 polygons. This one here has 180 polygons, but they look identical, which is crazy. You mean, like, how could this be done? It's magic. I'm sorry, I like this. I think it's cool. So how can we do it? There are two workflows to retopologize. There is a high polygon model to retopologizing to baking, or you can take a low poly model and then go to a high poly model and then bake that. So let's talk about workflow one, and I promise I'll explain what baking is. So high poly topology. It's good for characters, organic shapes, or things that will be animated. You can be free to sculpt high poly however you like. So in this workflow, you're going to make a really high quality, high poly model, and everything I just taught you about topology, throw it out the window. Don't care, whatever. Sculpt however you want to sculpt, but know that you may pay a little bit for it later. But right now, just sculpt however you want to sculpt, make it look exactly how you want it to be. It's going to be smooth and easy to do. Workflow 2, you're going to make a low poly model. You're going to think about the topology of it. You're going to make that block out and make a low poly version of something you're making. This is good for hard surfaces, props for games, or environmental assets. You plan your topology from the start, and then the baking is going to be predictable. So I know this is confusing. I will explain. That first one, high poly retopology. Step 1 is you're creating that high poly model. You don't worry about topology. You sculpt and model freely. So you've pulled this off. You've done it. You've made something that looks great. Step 2, you're going to create a new mesh, a plane. You're going to enable snapping and shrink wrap. And definitely, if you're doing this one, Google retopology, find a step-by-step comprehensive guide or a YouTube tutorial the first time you do it. It's going to help you. And now you're going to basically 3D trace over your high topology model, and you're going to make a new retopology mesh, and it's going to stick to your model. So you're basically taking that really high detail model that you made as a guide, and then you're making a low poly mesh and laying it out over it. So in the end, you're going to have a low poly, really good topology model that looks a lot like that original one. However, even once you've done this, that low poly model isn't going to look as high quality as that high poly. So here's how you're going to fix that. Now you're going to bake it. And baking is a little complicated. I'm going to go over it for both of these in a second, but the important part is that you have a low poly model that has good topology, and you have a really high poly model that looks really nice, but doesn't have to have amazing topology. Okay, the other type of retopology workflow, a low poly to high poly. So step one is creating a low poly model. You focus on good topology and simple blockout of shapes. So have good topology, have a good blockout layout. You're going to make some kind of, let's say that you're making like my example that I gave before, you're making a ruin wall. So it's going to have some brick looking pieces. It's going to have a jagged edge at the top. You make that low poly version of that, make a simple blockout. Now, step two, take that model. While being careful not to change the silhouette, you're going to duplicate the low poly model and refine it and add detail. So you made that low poly, you duplicate it, and now you refine, add a bunch of detail to it. So you end up with the same kind of situation as the first one. In the first situation, you had a high poly model, you made a low poly over it. Now you have a low poly and you refine it into a high poly, and you end up in the same spot, which is that you have a really high quality model and you have a less high quality low poly model, but with good topology that you really wish looked like that high poly model. So here's the magic step. Either way, your end goal is to bake it. You're going to copy texture info from the complex model to the simple model. You can make this in Blender. You can make this in Substance Painter. I've done it in Substance Painter before, which works really well. But mainly, you're doing this so that you can take that information that the more complicated model has, the information about how the light hits and what parts have shadows, and you're going to create texture maps that like normal maps, ambient occlusion maps. There's a lot of different types of maps that you can generate from this, but then when you apply them to your low poly, it's going to have all that information that the high poly had. So these are a high poly and low poly model, and the low poly looks almost identical to the high poly, but this one's going to run super well in a game, and this one might break the game. So baking, the actual steps of how to do this, which isn't too complicated, is going to happen further along in your modeling process than we are going to cover today. So don't worry about that right now. First, make that amazing model and just know that you should follow either this step or this step at some point. And then that's going to help you make that really performant model. This is super important, especially for game design, which you are all going into because you're in EGaDS. Okay, that is the end of the modeling workshop portion of today's workshop. Does anyone have any final questions that I would be very happy to answer? Nothing? Okay.
Oh wait.
Yeah?
The horror game that you guys that's on there, like, is this something you have been working on, or is it like a one night thing?
Honestly, I'm not sure if they're doing a new one or if it's... I mean, this is something that people have been working on for a while. We've done dev nights for a while, but I'm not sure if this specific event is a long-term or shorter-term one. But I could DM an officer for you and find out. Apologies. These are upcoming events. Yeah, we have dev nights on the 11th, speaker night on the 19th. We have another workshop, a Unity workshop, on the 24th. And then on the 1st, we've got Game Sprouts again. Remember, it's a $100 prize pool for the most participation, so get that prize pool. And then, really exciting, we've got GDC Squared, 10 a.m. to 9 p.m. GDC Auditorium on the 6th and 7th. So make sure that you make an appearance. It's going to be super cool. We're going to have people from the industry there. We're going to have Artist Alley. It's going to be really awesome. Okay, so that ends my portion of tonight's workshop. Thank you everyone for showing up. We are going to have a live demo from Lexi, who's currently in a class, but is going to be here around 7, and she's going to have her own computer to stream. So you guys are going to be in the dark for about 15-20 minutes, but do not fear. Lexi's going to be here soon and is going to help you out. Going to give you a really cool demo actually in Blender, applying some of the stuff that I just talked about. So I'm signing off for now. Goodbye. This was super fun. And I will have to hear from you guys at our next workshop. Bye!